Welcome back. We're talking about accusations that Russia has invaded Ukraine. And joining us from London is a former journalist and advisor to the Kremlin, Alexander Nekrasov. Alexander, thanks for joining us. There we heard President Obama placing the blame for what is going on in eastern Ukraine firmly at the door of Moscow. NATO now accusing Russia of, quote, blatant violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, saying Russian forces and equipment are now operating inside Ukraine. What do you make of all these accusations being made against Russia?
Well, it's all part of the political pressure which is exerted by America and NATO on Russia. This is a game which has been played for quite some time. We know, for example, the methods which are used. You know, remember the MH17 flight, Malaysian Boeing, that was shot over Ukraine. Now, notice the silence now. It was used as a campaign against Russia to accuse the Russian government of being complicit in that crime. But now it's total silence. Nobody's talking about it because the evidence points to completely different people. And we're having the same situation here. Now, President Obama is saying that Russia is financing, arming, and supporting the so-called rebels in eastern Ukraine. He might have said that about, by the way, America and ISIS, but this is beside the point. And the point is this: there's a popular uprising going on in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is unable or unwilling to resolve this situation. It's using its own troops to kill and bombard whole territories in the east, instead of using diplomacy and instead of sitting down and talking to the representatives of the East. So what does it do? It is blaming Russia for the popular uprising in the East caused by the coup in February in Kiev. And that's why we're witnessing all these sudden rushes to find proof of the presence of the Russian troops in the eastern Ukraine. Now, let me tell you something about the presence of the Russian troops. If there were Russian troops, really Russian troops, special forces, in the east of Ukraine, the Ukrainian army will be regrouping in Poland by now, because these are highly trained professional soldiers. What we are witnessing there is that we have volunteers coming from, by the way, not only Russia, but other former Soviet republics, and fighting the neo-Nazi threat that they see spreading to the east. This is very important, not to call these people pro-Russian separatists. They do not want the east of Ukraine to join Russia. They want east of Ukraine to become part of a federal state, you know, and have its own legitimate powers. That's the whole point.
All right. Alexander, the United States also said via its UN ambassador, it said that Russia had, quote, outright lied over its military activity inside Ukraine. And then the Ukrainian deputy ambassador to the UN, he also spoke at that Emergency Security Council meeting on Thursday. This is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
The world is challenged by a military nuclear might, ignoring universal principles and craving an absolute power. How many more red lines are to be crossed before this challenge is addressed? We call upon this Council to fulfill its charter responsibility and take the urgent measures to stop the aggression against a sovereign UN member state.
You see, the problem is with the Security Council is that it doesn't want to listen to other sides of the story. Unfortunately, we have a representative of a government which is ordering its troops to kill civilians in the east, blaming Russia for all of the Ukraine's woes. And this is, you know, this represents a very strange situation. We have bizarre statements coming out of Kiev practically every day, and then these statements, which are not even provided by any evidence at all, are being picked up by the Western media and by Western politicians who claim that they know things. And then when the Russian government and Russian officials ask them to produce any evidence, no evidence is provided. It looks bizarre, to be honest. It looks very strange. And what is even stranger is that, the public opinion, for example, in Germany, in Britain, in France, has long ago turned against this sort of propaganda. People I speak to, even journalists, by the way, who tell me they understand the dangers of this conflict in Ukraine, and they understand the dangers of its spreading, and they also understand the legitimate interests of Russia to be worried about a civil war getting out of control on its borders. And yet, politicians representing these very same countries come up with absolutely preposterous statements that have nothing to do with reality.
What about the satellite images that have been produced by NATO? NATO says that these satellite images, they're clear evidence that Russia has troops and equipment right inside Ukraine.
Well, this is also a very strange thing with the satellite images. First of all, NATO is producing not its own images, not from the military satellites. These are commercial images taken by commercial satellites that were either sold or passed over to NATO. Secondly, these images were taken a week before the situation on the ground deteriorated. So why they present old images, I don't know. Thirdly, these images prove absolutely nothing, because the volunteers, the anti-government forces, have captured so many tanks and armored personnel carriers and artillery pieces and even other heavy equipment, that what is the point of trying to prove that these weapons have come from Russia?
Yeah, the situation is clearly escalating, and now we have the Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who is now talking again about Ukrainian membership of NATO. I mean, how is Moscow going to respond to that if Ukraine goes ahead and seeks formal membership of NATO?
Well, first of all, let's make this clear. These people who were behind the coup and who seized power in Kiev were always bent on NATO membership. They were never hiding this fact. They were openly talking about it. They were openly hostile to the ethnic Russians in Ukraine. They were openly saying that they should leave Ukraine. So for Mr. Yatsenyuk to suddenly start talking now about joining NATO, this was always on the cards. And I can tell you that, for example, some leaders in Europe, like Angela Merkel, for example, they understand perfectly well that if NATO is dragged into NATO, if Ukraine is dragged into NATO, this will escalate the crisis in Ukraine and escalate the tension across Europe as a whole. Russia will have to respond to that. This will be madness.
Now, President Vladimir Putin in Moscow is calling upon the anti-government forces in eastern Ukraine to create this, what he calls a humanitarian corridor, because Ukrainian forces have been surrounded by anti-government rebels. What kind of influence and control does Moscow have over these anti-government forces in eastern Ukraine?
Well, I think that the control Moscow has over the anti-government forces in East Ukraine has been greatly exaggerated, because there were several times when Moscow, for example, was calling for a ceasefire, for certain agreements, and the anti-government forces didn't respond. They have a battle on their hands there, and I can tell you that Moscow doesn't really know, everything that's going on there. And I think that President Putin simply decided to make this appeal to the anti-government forces in Ukraine on humanitarian grounds, because let's face it, huge numbers of Ukrainian troops are being surrounded, up to 7,000. These are young people, 19, 18-year-olds who don't want to die. And I think it was very proper for him to call on them to open those corridors and let them out. So I don't really understand the criticism coming from some quarters saying, well, you see, that proves he has influence and he's basically commanding those rebels, in inverted commas. And I don't think so. I think it was just a humanitarian appeal to save the lives of thousands of young Ukrainians.
One other development that we've had over the past few days, the United Nations Human Rights Group has released a report accusing, actually both sides, accusing anti-government forces in eastern Ukraine as well as Ukrainian forces of widespread human rights abuses, murder, torture, abductions. What do you know about that? And is Russia aware of this? Is Russia going to do anything about that?
Well, I've seen that report, yes. It sort of blames both sides for civilian deaths. It puts the number of deaths slightly over 2,000 of civilians, but it does also point out that there are probably more dead civilians there. According to some numbers I've heard coming from Ukraine, there are about 6,000 dead civilians, 11,000 Ukrainian troops killed, and no specific numbers on the casualties among the anti-government forces, because obviously it's very difficult to confirm them. But in any case, we are talking about a huge tragedy, humanitarian tragedy, and tragedy in the sense of civilians being caught in the fighting. And I think that, of course, until President Poroshenko realizes that only diplomatic solution is possible to this, I think that he is realizing that. I've heard that from my sources that during his talks with Angela Merkel was very strong on the diplomatic side, and she was telling Mr. Poroshenko that he really needs to get his act together, or he will lose the support of the European Union. And as I hear that Mr. Poroshenko realizes now that that would be devastating for him and his regime.
Okay, Alexander, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us, sir.